Thank you. And thank you all for being here. It's been such a really fascinating conference, and all the discussion has been so worthwhile. I'm glad to add my part into it. I'm going to open with a stanza from a poem from Herman Taub. The poem is called Refugee, and the title for my talk is taken from it. I became a nomad in the land of nomadic tribes, traveling from Siberia to friendly Central Asia, to become a statistic among a refugee throng of Volga Germans, Ukrainians, Belarusians, Tartars, Poles, and Jews. Some European Jews became refugees before the war, when they were fortunate enough to get out of Europe and to begin to build new lives abroad. They had to function as foreigners, finding their way in new cultural landscapes while watching the unfolding of the destruction from afar. Other European Jews became refugees after the war, wandering, lost, bereft. They searched for remnants of their lives and then began to rebuild. The population I study spent the entire war as refugees. Indeed, each time they began to get their footing, they were exiled, deported, repatriated, or depatriated once again. It's thus hardly surprising that two of the published memoirs about this experience use the Hebrew term Nomad from the Curse of Cain in Genesis 4:12 in their titles to encapsulate that experience. The doubling of the nearly synonymous Hebrew words in the original is usually translated as ceaseless wandering. Freda Zerubbabel's Navanad Farsechanon von a Pleta, the Navanad, or the wanderings of a refugee, and Joseph Goldkorn's Navanad über die Schlachen von Russland, both draw on the power of this well-known phrase to quickly and effectively characterize their war years for a Yiddish-speaking audience. Writing in a Yizker book, Josef Schwartz entitled his contribution Joren von a Navanad, again, the years of a ceaseless wanderer. Here was clearly a phrase to which these refugees, who spent their war years continually on the move and reinventing themselves in new and challenging situations, could relate. The initial move was their own choice. That is, in the fall of 1939, the Polish Jews who I'm studying opted to flee from their homes in the areas taken over by the Germans and relocate to the territories now under Soviet control. Subsequent moves were often beyond their control. After several months as refugees in the newly annexed Soviet territories of Western Ukraine and Western Belarus, they registered to return to their homes, that is, to go back to Nazi-occupied Poland. But the trains that they boarded took them instead to labor camps and collective farms in the Arctic, northern Kazakhstan, and Siberia. These refugees cum deportees became slave laborers until their unexpected release following the German invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941. Refugees once again, they migrated out of the camps and mostly into Central Asia, looking for work, food, shelter in what they hoped would be more favorable conditions. During this period, the refugees struggled to survive, but also managed to recreate some of their cultural life. In 1946, yet another train journey brought the refugees back to Poland, where they joined the survivors of the Holocaust in coming to terms with their losses and attempting to reestablish their communities. Most decided not to stay in Poland, opting instead to join the flow of displaced persons converging in the British and American zones. There they took part in DP life, largely indistinguishable from other Polish survivors, and awaited opportunities to emigrate. Once their papers arrived, they became refugees yet again. Outside of Europe, in Israel, in Palestine, in the United States, in Australia, and wherever else they found refuge. This paper will focus on the Polish Jewish refugees' period of displacement in Central Asia, roughly from 1941 to 1946. I'm in the process of writing a book about all of their wanderings, but I want to focus on this period today, which I think presents some interesting contrasts and crossovers. It was the period where they were furthest from their home, from their comfort zones. But it was also the time where they had the greatest cultural autonomy, that is, in their period in the Soviet Union. They were terribly alone and isolated, but they also recognized, as in the excerpted poem, that they had something in common, at least symbolically, with the other peoples in the region. They were surrounded by other exiled, deported, and evacuated groups, but also by locals, former nomads, tribal peoples, and even Jews from entirely different backgrounds. So this paper is about the Polish Jews' efforts to survive as refugees, but also how they tried to make sense of their experience in these exotic and unexpected surroundings. To begin with, why Central Asia? Most of the Polish Jews who made their way to Central Asia after their release from the labor camps and collective farms had no idea what to expect there. They knew precious little about the area, much of it coming from the popular children's book City of Bread, in which a plucky youngster travels to Tashkent in order to get grain seeds for his Ukrainian peasant family. Although this 1923 Russian classic is filled with hunger and loss, it's ultimately a story of hope wherein this resilient child is able to overcome all odds and help his family. Many Polish Jews in their memoirs and testimonies name this text as their primary reason for traveling south. And if any of you have read the book, it's terrible. It's a horrible book. I would never want to go there based on the book, but somehow the title, just the title alone, City of Bread, it's attractive. After years of laboring in the cold and hungry north, they longed for bread, as well as for the better produce and climatic conditions that the area promised. In his ironic reference to the fantasies engendered by this book and to their disappointment, Yitzhak Perlov entitled the chapter of his memoir describing the Uzbek capital, Tashkent, City of Want. Another reason mentioned by some of the Zionists among the refugees was the attraction of closer proximity to Palestine. It turned out to be nearly impossible to escape from the Soviet Union. Although, as we heard in another talk earlier, a small number of the refugees did manage to get out with the Polish army via Iran and ended up in Palestine. So that's a whole nother interesting and colorful story, which I won't talk about today. In his dissertation, Shlomo Kless claims that some of these Zionist activists actually did manage to get out and reach the Yishuv. I haven't read those accounts. Over time, what became the major reason for squatting in railroad stations over thousands of miles was the rumored presence of other Polish Jews. That is, most of the Polish Jewish refugees went south hoping to find friends, relatives, landsmen, at least other people with whom they shared common language and culture. Along the way, and the way often took weeks because the troop trains obviously had priority and civilian travel was pushed to the side, sometimes for days or weeks at a time. Slowly, they gathered in numbers and in information. They picked up rumors and information about their loved ones along the way. So in their desire for company, at least they were not disappointed. On the contrary, the first image that most of the memoirs and testimonies of reaching Central Asia is not of the vast open land or the different types of people, but of the tremendous overcrowding of the railway stations. The numbers of evacuees and refugees converging in the southern regions of the country with little infrastructure and under-resourced to begin with were tremendous. After discussing the tent cities, the desperate individuals living in them, the army of thieves that grew up to harass and dispossess them, and the hunger, the severe hunger that they experienced, most of the refugees then moved on. They left the major cities on the whole. Some were fortunate to find places of work and be able to stay there, and most went elsewhere. They found work and housing in smaller cities, in rural communities, on collective farms throughout Central Asia. Many survived on the black or gray market, selling their remaining goods or trading goods between locations. Some were able to work in their own fields, many in factories that sprang up to meet the needs of the military. Survival was far more difficult than what they had imagined. Even with jobs, the refugees always had the lowest priority, the fewest ration card points, and no access to the protexia that Soviet citizens could sometimes call upon. This situation was particularly disastrous when it came to health care. The overcrowding combined with the climate led to epidemics, malaria, typhus, dysentery. And with the military requisitioning most medicines and many medical professionals, the few local hospitals utterly unprepared for the population influx, there were simply no beds for refugees in dire need. Many Polish Jewish families who'd managed to survive the harsh climes of Siberia lost members during their sojourn in Central Asia. Already in weakened condition from their period of harsh labor, they could not withstand the diseases. The first months were often the most difficult as the refugees struggled to find the necessities for survival. Gradually, most of them did find housing and work and settled in to wait out the war. Everyone in the Soviet Union during this period experienced the tremendous anxiety, especially of that first year and a half of the war when Germany seemed invincible. Everyone was making great sacrifices. But as a result of the need for able-bodied soldiers, there was also a general relaxation in the level of supervision in daily lives of Soviet citizens and of others sojourning there. And this extended to the refugees as well. These then were the ironies of the refugees' situation. They traveled to Central Asia in order to find better access to food and instead found starvation and epidemics. On the other hand, the terrible war raging in the West meant that this was the period of greatest scope for cultural expression in the Soviet Union, and in the midst of these strange contradictions, they found themselves also among a great variety of other ethnic, national, and religious groups, some of them with whom the Polish Jews had historically difficult relations, others of whom were their co-religionists, but from very distant and different experiences, and some were entirely unknown to them previously. And that's my final topic I want to deal with, the types of interactions that developed, and especially how the Jewish refugees assimilated and described these interactions is the focus for the final third of the paper. One might have expected that the most meaningful relationships they formed would be with other Jews. Indeed, the Polish Jews were fascinated by Soviet Jews like themselves, but surprisingly uninterested in the Bukharan Jews and other Eastern Jewish communities they encountered. In the hundreds of memoirs and testimonies that I've read, numerous descriptions of interactions with Ashkenazi Soviet Jews come up, whereas the local Jews are seen from a distance on the whole. To give an example, Bernard Ginsberg entered Soviet territory with his family, but ended up tramping through Central Asia as a student, a professional photographer, and a drifter avoiding the draft. Along the way, he made friends with many people, and he writes most vividly about the Soviet Jews he encountered. One family, the Jaffes, themselves evacuees from Ukraine, fed him occasionally during his student years in Kizilkia. Another family, as the war was ending and rumors of repatriation began, tried to get him to marry their daughter so that she might be able to leave the Soviet Union with him. At one point, he was able to spend the Jewish holiday of Rosh Hashanah with his brother, on leave from the Red Army, in a Bukharan synagogue in Tashkent. But beyond mentioning, just in one sentence, the oddness of the experience of being there, he doesn't offer any details. Ginsberg provides the names and impressions of Yiddish-speaking Soviet Jews, but the non-Ashkenazi Jews of Tashkent are characterized only by their difference. He was able to spend the New Year with them, and he shared that, but he doesn't seem to have really interacted with them. Ginsberg's depiction is fairly standard. The only exception I've found is a refugee child who ended up in a Soviet orphanage after the death of his parents. He managed to make contact with a local Bukharan Jewish family who often invited him for the Sabbath evening meal. So this is a child absolutely desperate for love and food, and he found this family with whom he shared something. Even if the tunes were different, even if the customs were different, they recognized a commonality which seemingly many of the adult refugees weren't able to recognize and find. The evacuated Soviet Jews from Ukraine, from Moscow, from Leningrad, however, were like them and yet different. The older generation spoke Yiddish and retained a knowledge of traditional Ashkenazi Jewish life. The younger generations, cut off from tradition by Soviet rule, remained a subject of fascination. What did it mean to be Jewish in the absence of Jewish practice? What did it mean to be Jewish and a true believer in Soviet communism? How could they discuss what they shared with these people? Many of the former refugees told stories in their post-war reminiscences of the moments when the barriers broke down. In the case of Bernard Ginsberg, that was the family who I mentioned who wanted him to marry their daughter, that up until that point, until there were rumors of that he was actually going to be able to leave. They never mentioned any dissatisfaction with where they lived. But suddenly, when the possibility of being able to get one member out of the country appeared, they were all of a sudden quite eager to take that opportunity. And he writes how humanizing that was, that to see them in a different light. Several testimonies mention the use of Yiddish as a sort of code language. Even a single word in Yiddish delivered from a Soviet Jew was a promise of help, but also an admission that das Pintel Yid, that little elemental Jewishness, still existed. Michael Sherwood used this code quite literally upon arriving at another labor camp. He was moved around to several camps, weakened and malnourished. He took a chance with the new commandant there, whispering Amcha, I'm of your people, to see if he would understand. And he was rewarded with the comparatively light work of painting indoors. Particularly interesting to the Polish Jews were the remnants of Judaism that survived. Rabbi Yisrael Gerber, a yeshiva student before the war, credits his escape from the Soviet Union to Shanghai to a sympathetic Jewish official in Moscow. According to Gerber, the bureaucrat's mother was still religiously observant and convinced him to have pity on the group of yeshiva students. Most of the people that the Polish Jews interacted with, however, on a daily basis, were not fellow Jews. They had to contend with living and working with people from throughout the Soviet Union. Often these people's languages, customs, and ways of life were shockingly different. Some of the Polish Jews reacted with fear, disgust, a great sense of cultural superiority. Others tried to find commonalities, to point out what the groups had in common, and yet others saw their fellow humans mostly at a distance in the aggregate, rather than reporting on individual interactions. For these refugees, the foreign people were part of the scenery of the foreign land. Yitzhak Ehrlichson refers to the colorful Uzbek people and Bukharan Jews in one enthusiastic sentence when describing his experience. They presented a fascinating tableau and background to his adventures. Oh, thanks. And this is literally the case. I just brought one image. This is just a photograph taken of a book. It's not a high-quality image, but this is a wonderful children's book, How I Learned Geography by Uri Shulevitz. You might have read it to your children. So the book is actually about how his father helped him, by giving him a map, helped him find something to dream about while they were so hungry in Turkestan. And I mean, this is just literally the colorful market scene is the background. This is not what the story is about. The story is about the father and the son over there in the corner and their experiences. So I just thought that was a fun illustration. For Yankel Saylor, the Uzbek people served as a foil to the ethnic Poles. At the end of his testimony, expanding on his overall impressions, he says that the Uzbeks treated the refugees like himself as human beings, while the Catholic Poles only abused Jews both before, during, and after the war. Yet although he offers specific examples of beatings and name-calling by Poles, he doesn't expand at all on his interactions with the Uzbeks. They remain an undifferentiated, albeit positive, whole. Commenting perhaps on this tendency, Helen Starkiewicz recalls her thoughts when the Kazakh people on the collective farm where she worked as a nurse held a goodbye party before her repatriation. And I quote here, "During that last night on the kolkhoz, I came to the conclusion that I knew too little about these people, that I'd not learned much from them, and had been too preoccupied with teaching them how to live, to avoid disease, guard against infection, and so on. I had considered the kolkhoz to be a temporary stage in my life, and had not attached much importance to my surroundings. I hadn't really tried to understand the culture and traditions to which they were so attached." As Starkiewicz points out, it was not only the cultural and linguistic divide that separated people, but also the difficult circumstances under which they all lived. The suffering brought on by war preoccupied many people and turned their attention inward. At the same time, shared suffering can, in some circumstances, lead to greater mutual understanding. Marie Bush depicts the conditions these specific conditions as what unified people during the war. She relates her positive reactions with Russians in their town of exile and says everyone was starving and everyone was stealing. Similarly, Sally Albin points out in her testimony, that the Russians on the kolkhoz in Jambul were not anti-Semitic. They felt sorry for the starving refugees and shared with them when they could. Other refugees found additional commonalities. One way that some of them sought to make sense of the vastly different peoples and places was to assimilate them within familiar categories. In his memoir, for example, Aaron Blenketny continually finds comfortable Jewish images and words to describe his foreign encounters. Passing through Astrakhan with its profoundly foreign smells, tastes, and sounds, he remarked that it had been once the capital of the mythical Khazar kingdom. Upon hearing women keening in the streets, he said that it sounded just like Polish Jewish women at a funeral. After being invited to the home of his colleague at work, Adon Cossack, Blenketny described, and he uses the word ner tamid, the light, the eternal light burning under his icon. For Yosef Goldkorn, the situation was the opposite. That is, rather than him finding commonalities with other people, they found them with him. He narrates friendly relations with his landlady, a Ukrainian, who, after having undergone collectivization and deportation, had sympathy on the refugees. After her husband came back from the front slightly wounded, she refused to allow him to evict the Goldkorns, as she believed that it was through their merit and their suffering that he had been blessed to return home alive. Seemingly, her perception of them as faultless victims, displaced and homeless, allowed her to see them as worthy of her attentions and able to bring benefit to her family. There are many other examples, of course, positive, negative, neutral, close, and distant, of interactions between Polish Jewish refugees and their neighbors in Soviet Central Asia. This is a brief selection which I hope offers a template for understanding how the Polish Jews ended up there and how they made sense of their experiences. All of the testimonies and memoirs cited in this particular paper, I use many other sources also, but just for this paper, come from decades after the war. And so I was interested not only in what they actually experienced, but also how they sought to make sense of it later, how they described it for others to understand. As is well known by now, people naturally make stories out of their experiences. They take a chaotic narrative and create comprehensible stories from it. In these stories, the refugees move south for better conditions and the possibility of reconnecting with people like them. Once in the Central Asian republics, they interacted with others as well. Most of their narratives focus, of course, on their own families, on Polish Jews like them, who they spent the most time with, but they also talk about their interest in Ashkenazi Soviet Jews and intermittently about other groups. It makes sense that they're, okay, a couple thoughts to end with. I know I'm getting to the end here. Okay. I think that some of the, both the reticence to talk about their experiences with other people in Central Asia and perhaps the way that memory changed those experiences in retrospect have to do with the Cold War and with knowledge of the Holocaust. Tamar Lewinsky and the other one, Laura Yokush, wrote an article about how the Cold War played out in people's willingness to talk about their positive experiences sometimes in the Soviet Union, particularly in the 1950s. The memoirs from then are sometimes just fiercely anti-communist, but even the later ones, they don't focus a lot on the help they got from people along the way. But the other silencing factor, I would say, is the Holocaust, that as a whole, when they came back, they didn't talk at all. They didn't talk a great deal about their experiences, and they certainly didn't want to talk about the positive parts. We were having a nice time getting to know other foreign interesting peoples while you were suffering here. And I just want to end, as I began, with an excerpt from a poem, and this is from Binyamin Harshav, known then in his early post-war book of poetry under the name of H. Binyamin, in which it's called Ofenten Steppe, so the evening in the steppe, and he's describing looking back in 1946 from the DP camps at his experience in Central Asia, he doesn't talk about the people he met there. He talks about the emptiness and the silence. And he says, "Only now I realize the meaning of the silence. And although the cold night covers me, hate has ignited a fire in me, hate born inside deep wounds. I wipe away the tears from my burning eyes. Emotions in me will be like stars at dawn, lapsed, and I remain speechless."